Hello again, and now we'll start the second panel, which concerns the environment and the European Union. In this panel, our esteemed speakers are Mr. Spyros Kouvelis, who is the director of the EPLO Institute for Sustainable Development, and also a senior associate at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He also was a Minister of State for Foreign Economic, Cultural, and Environmental Affairs, while a former MP. He will talk about the global challenges, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the EU Green Deal. We also have Mr. Dimitris Karavellas, who is the CEO of WWF Greece, while also the chair of the WWF Mediterranean Marine Initiative. His title of speech is The Role of Young Citizens in Building Back a Better Europe. We then welcome Mr. Nikos Zaimis, who is a senior advisor in the European Commission in the Directorate General for Trade, on Trade and Sustainable Development, while also the General Scheme of Preferences and Economic Partnership Agreements with Africa and Pacific countries. He will talk to us about how the EU promotes values and standards on the protection of the environment through its trade policy. We then welcome Mr. Jesus Urios, who is a junior policy analyst for low carbon and circular economy in the Institute for European Environmental Policy. And he'll talk to us about the EU Green Deal, what it is and its implication for citizens. So this panel is especially important to us because we feel that as a generation, we have a responsibility to act against climate change in order to ensure a better future. So the EU has embarked on a very promising mission with the Green Deal. And we'll touch upon some of the questions we feel are very vital here. So what is the European Green Deal? What are the main initiatives under the deal? And what do they mean for Europeans? But also concerning the Green Deal, the COVID-19 pandemic and green recovery, how much time will be needed to put the European Green Deal into recovery action? And how does it survive the pandemic? Finally, we'll also discuss what is the space for action from society, from us, the youth, and schools in the Greek Revolution. So I would like to now welcome Mr. Kouvelis to begin his speech.
Thank you very much, Stafi. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the invitation, and congratulations to you and the entire team for putting together this very interesting event. I also have to note that your organizational capacities are very impressive, so well done there. Good morning to all the co-speakers, to Dimitris Karavellas, a friend from old days, and to the new friends that will be speaking together. If you don't mind, I would like to share some slides. So let me see if we can do this. Yeah, okay. So I will go quickly through some of the issues that I consider the most important ones in the sense of global challenges that we face, because what I will be mostly speaking is in the context of the overall sustainable development, as the environment is connected with everything else related to, for example, social or economic development and issues that are related to everyday life. So I usually like to start my presentation on sustainable development by giving a sense of perspective so that we know where we are and who we are. And so my first slide is this. This is a slide, it's an actual picture taken from the Mars rover, and it shows the Earth as the sun is setting on the planet Mars. And it's quite interesting to see that not only we are a small dot in the sky, but also it seems to be the only planet that we know can host life, at least for now. This is a picture coming closer. It's a picture from the International Space Station, and it's very interesting to look how different Earth is from other planets in the sense of having the atmosphere, the water environment, and everything. But this one is even more interesting. It's a picture that shows this is the Gibraltar Strait, this is Morocco here, and this is Spain, Madrid, Sevilla, if I remember right, and so on. And it's very interesting to see how the presence of humans has actually covered almost everything that you can see, at least in one big part of the world. And one of the reasons why there is so much spread of the human presence on the planet has come from, well, besides economic development and the Industrial Revolution, one thing is how food has started becoming a much more available resource for people to feed the increasing population. With a side effect, of course, because this is the use of commercial fertilizer used on farms from the 1900s to this one goes up to 1995, before 2000. And we see the increase of the use of fertilizer and pesticides went along with that. One very important second aspect was the change in health sciences. We heard a few things from the previous session about vaccinations and also overall health science. And one of the very important effects of all this, so economic development, food, and the Green Revolution, and health development, was the increase of the world population. If you look at this picture, it shows that the increase of the world population, this is the actual population increase, and this is the rate of increase. So we see that even when the rate of increase starts becoming slower and it's becoming lower rate of increase, the population keeps on going up. And we're foreseeing a 10.9 billion in 2100, when the rate of increase will have reached something like 0.1%, and still increasing at this stage. The important thing with world population is that it's not even. So if you see what is happening, this is a map that I like very much. What is happening with the increase of population per hour around the planet, that means which is the overall increase if you add births and you subtract deaths every day. So you have Lagos with 85 new lives coming on the planet every hour, Kinshasa 63, Istanbul 19, New York 10, London 9. Very interesting case, Tokyo -1 is the only place in the world where the population is actually shrinking by numbers. The other thing that is very important is the increase in economic output in GDP per capita. This is the case of England from 1270 to almost 2020. And you can see that around the time of the Industrial Revolution and all the other things that I mentioned before, Green Revolution and so on, the increase is exponential. It's more than exponential, actually. It's an almost vertical line. And this again goes with the differences in the sharing of gross domestic product and wealth around the planet. So you can see the countries that have a high income per capita and lots of countries, especially Africa and Southeast Asia, that have a much lower income per capita. The same picture is reflected in the hunger map. You can see that in the hunger map, a lot of countries around, especially Africa and Southeast Asia, are having serious problems. And it's very interesting to read this one specifically that says that climate variability and extremes are among the key drivers of hunger, especially in the poorest areas of the world. Case of health is not different. The case of health and the burden of disease obviously impacts more the countries that do not have resources. And it's very interesting to say that the countries that have the least per capita GDP per capita are the ones that are also spending the least percentage of this GDP per capita for health protection. So inequality is the main line around the world and how the development is going in the planet. And the same is very much the case for the urban centers, for the urban development. This is a picture from the Nairobi suburbs, and this is the big, it's a couple of million more, 5 million people living in this slum just outside Nairobi. You can see Nairobi down here, and you can see right next to the slum a very interesting golf course. So inequality is the mainstream thing also in regards to cities. And it is a very important case because this is where most of the human population will be concentrated in the years to come. It's already almost done. Very important also is education. This is a case that I have singled out in education for girls. And it shows that in 2015, we have 1.2 billion of the overall 7.3 billion in Africa. If rapid education development was to happen, this percentage would be decreased because of the 8.9 billion in the world, Africa would only have 1.9 billion people living on it. If education trends continue, this 1.9 becomes 2.5 and then 9.6 billion. And if education is stalled and it does not improve, Africa would have 3.2 billion. Now add this to what I said before about Africa not having many chances in the case of distribution of GDP, of health issues and so on. So education, and especially for women, is extremely important. Well, this is also a very interesting table. I don't have much time to go into detail. It's a table created by Stephen and his partners in the trajectory of the Anthropocene and the great acceleration of the systems. The orange graphs show the socioeconomic trends of population, GDP, foreign direct investment, fertilizer consumption, water use, and so on. But interestingly, at the same time, all the Earth systems, they get an analogous pressure of all the issues that are important. So surface temperature, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone, tropical forest loss, and so on. What does this show? This is a very interesting graph, that the ecological footprint, so the hectares per person per year, is when you put it on a graph with the Human Development Index, you see that the poorest countries have a low ecological footprint because they cannot consume the resources that they do. But here you have the EU member states and USA, one of the highest. One of the best actually is Japan, but the problem is that everybody should be right here. And I have to say, maybe Dimitris will refer to that, the World Overshoot Day that has been established by WWF is a very interesting case where we try to show, WWF and the NGOs that work with it, try to show that we have to get a tendency to move towards this green square, otherwise we're in trouble, because you consume more than what our planet can produce. Climate change is probably the biggest case. Climate change is, this is a mapping of the global temperature changes. That's from the 1850s until now. And you can see the changes as they go, they become into the red for every year, systematically, starting from the end of the 1900s until now. I also have a short video, but I'm not sure it will carry properly through Zoom. Let me try to see if you will see it, because it's just a half minute, but it's very, very interesting. Can you see the video?
Yes, we can see it.
So this shows actually the temperature anomalies by countries from 1800 to 2017. And you can see that everything, as we're moving along time, 1952, 1956, and so on, goes from the blue to the red. And it's becoming a pattern, which is exactly what science have been saying, that climate change is a pattern, that there is a lot of changes, and you can see that now we're deep into the red. And this is why climate change is probably the most important of all the, not only environmental, but also social problems that we need to address. Let me go back to our presentation. So here we are. And climate change is not only a case of what the environment, how the environment changes, but this is the disaster-induced displacement worldwide in 2012. You can see what I have put here in the round, that the worldwide displacement of people in 2012 was 32.4 million people. And this is increasing because you have cases where, for example, with the Hurricane Sandy, you had 776,000 people displaced. You had the same problems in Cuba, in Nigeria, in Niger because of the rainy season, North Korea, Japan, and so on. So climate change is impacting everything on life and creates a lot of displacement of people. And all of these problems that I mentioned, which were the big, let's say, trends, the big trends and the big challenges that we're facing, have started being discussed in 1972 in this very historic presentation and book, The Limits of Growth, by Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows, Jürgen Randers, and William Behrens. Soon after this, in 1987, the Sustainable Development Committee of the United Nations under Gro Harlem Brundtland coined the definition of what sustainable development is. And it's the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And some very important benchmarks are all the global conventions that were agreed by the UN. In my view, very important: 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity; 92, again, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change; and 94, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, although each of these conventions is very, very important. And of course, in 2015, the agreement in Paris for curbing climate change, and the agreement at the same time, same year, to actually have the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by all of the countries of the world, 157 countries. On the more complicated things, what has been calculated is that between 3.3 and 4.5 trillion dollars need to be spent per year so that we can achieve the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is impacting on environmental, social, and governance. And this is, for me, the point where it is important to see what the European Union is doing. So the European Union, through the Green Deal that has been mentioned by many speakers before, is becoming the global leader in how it's aiming to push for sustainable development and for curbing climate change. And this is because the sustainability, Europe, through its work on the Green Deal, is committing to being fully committed to the 2030 SDG agenda. It needs and wants to lead the global fight against climate change in the Paris Agreement that pursues high environmental standards, but also is very ambitious in its objectives to halt biodiversity loss, which is equally important, and promoting circular economy and zero pollution ambition. It's very interesting to see in this graph that it's not only climate and climate law, but also sustainable mobility, striving for greener industry, eliminating pollution, a just transition for all, financing green projects, and so on. Farm-to-fork projects. So it's covering all of the aspects of human life in a way. And to do this, not only it creates the policies, but also it creates the tools that will ensure this transition with a total of 150 billion over the period 2021 to 2027 with the Just Transition Fund, the InvestEU Just Transition Scheme, the support by the European Investment Bank, and so on. Still, it is a challenge because, as it has been heard before, absorbing all these funds and make them put to good use is not an easy thing. So if you allow me just to close by saying what I think we can do, because that's important in the discussion that we'll have afterwards for what the generation that you represent also can do. In our institute, the Institute for Sustainable Development, let me just say that it's part of the European Public Law Organization, which is a global, an international organization that is created by a number of countries around the world, and its headquarters are based in Greece under an agreement as a diplomatic mission. So two things that we're doing is the series of discussions for the climate law that is now being developed in Greece as a result of the agreement around Europe. I know, and we are in contact with Dimitris, that WWF has done some excellent work on preparing some draft points and actual document on this climate law. And we believe that we can contribute to this discussion also by including some aspects of the overall economy, how it needs to be fitting in. A discussion that we have going on also in web events on the use and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals by Greece. We try also to promote technology and good governance, and we are running this project funded by the Green Fund of the Ministry of Environment for actually bringing a point of agreement on how the deployment of renewable energy sources in Greece can happen without harming the natural environment and biodiversity. And we're soon to publish this very interesting publication by IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, in Greek, so it can be used as a guideline for everyone who's doing that. Lots of work on science and knowledge. So we started our first PhD on sustainable shipping and ESG investment. We just finished a series of seminars on biolaw and biotechnology. And of course, a lot of publications for regional work. I want to stay on this one just for a second. This is a publication that I had the honor to be the writer of this report that looks into the collaboration between the EU and the Gulf countries for how the blue economy can be a bridge of collaboration. And I'm mentioning it because I think that the European Union, through the Green Just Transition and the Green Pact that it's forming, is also reaching out to other regions, also through this work for food production in the Mediterranean and also North African countries. But sustainable development can be a very important point for regional collaboration. And finally, all the awareness work that we do by participating and providing a lot of content in different aspects, among which we want and we're planning to be present and participate and support the high-level political forum and the UN Climate Change Conference in the UK in November. Just to close, I think that if we want to really... sorry, somebody's microphone needs to be turned off.
Please mute yourselves.
That's good. Κοίταξε, τα κορίτσια Μαρίτα και Ζωή έχουν πάει για μπάνιο.
We'll mute everyone.
Can you just mute it from... Thank you. So just in closing, I think that what we are trying to contribute and what we believe is necessary for the SDGs to be implemented for sustainable development to happen is, on one hand, to create the partnerships and collaboration for what needs to be done, and also for the EU Green Deal. The second is to base everything we do on science, data, and analysis, because as was mentioned by the president of the Ocean Literacy Program of the OECD, the biggest problem with sustainable development is that its main opponent is misinformation. And the final part is governance. We believe that governance structures that allow the proper involvement of everyone, from the decision makers to governments to stakeholders and to NGOs, is the key, so that proper decisions taking everyone into account is important. So with this, I will stop, actually. I want to thank you very much. If you have any points, I will take them up with you later on in the discussion. And of course, you can note my email here and contact me if you want to send me a question after the event. Again, congratulations for your event, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your speech, giving us a full picture about the global environmental problems. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Karavellas to talk to us about the role of young citizens in building back a better Europe.
Well, good morning, and thank you. Let me begin by congratulating you for this initiative, and by thanking you for inviting me. I was very pleasantly surprised when I received a message from a young student from the school to speak at this event, and of course I immediately accepted the invitation. My brief intervention has you students in mind, and my 17-year-old daughter, and the millions of young citizens who live in Europe and who have a critical role, I believe, in shaping its future. I will skip a PowerPoint. Spiros has provided a lot of very interesting, I think, contextual information. But let me just start with a few words about the past and what has happened in the last few decades to this planet and to Europe. Since 1970, say the last 50 years, the emissions of CO2 have increased by 90%. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere right now are presently at a record high. And during that same time, that is in the last 50 years, on a global scale, we've lost roughly 2/3 of our wildlife. Things are a bit better in Europe. This figure is roughly 1/4. So without oversimplifying things too much, we have two global trends that are going in completely wrong directions. We have CO2 emissions that are increasing, and we're heating up as a result. And we have nature that's being lost, and the planet's health is going down. And with that, of course, we are losing the valuable services that nature provides to us. So now let's talk about the future. Imagine yourselves 10 to 15 years from now. You will have finished school, finished university perhaps. What types of jobs will you have found? Will COVID and other pandemics have disappeared? What will the world look like? What will Europe look like? Well, we don't have the answers to these questions, but we do know what needs to be done if we want to maintain our optimism. And in a nutshell, I would say what we need to do is to restore the balance. We need to reverse those two trends that I just mentioned. We need to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to restore nature. And we need to do it now. It's not fair to you, it's not fair to future generations, but the harsh reality is that if we don't achieve this in the next 10 to 15 years, we will have failed, and we will live with the consequences. Following now the tragic loss of millions of human lives from the pandemic, and the efforts, of course, underway to restore our health, to rebuild the damaged economy and society, it's clear that the Europe we build back needs to be green, it needs to be just, and it needs to be socially inclusive. Now, your role, that is the role of youth, of young citizens, is absolutely critical. By 2030, the number of youth in the world is projected to grow by 7% to 1.3 billion individuals. Young people aged 15 to 29 are presently about 20% of the present EU population. Now, what does that mean? Well, you are, or you will soon be, voters. This gives you power. This gives you the constitutional rights and privilege to hold governments and institutions accountable for their actions, demand transparency and consultation in decision-making. You are, or you can be, active citizens. All over the world, through initiatives like Fridays for Future, youth are standing up. They're making their voices heard. They're protesting against bad policies. They're demanding those policies that help us to build back better for the planet and for people. And of course, we know that this year in particular is going to be a critical year in Europe and beyond, with very, very important decisions hopefully to be taken internationally, both at the climate COP in Glasgow, but also at the CBD COP on biodiversity in China. And it's not just about protesting and demonstrating on the streets. There are many initiatives and organizations out there on the ground that are looking for your active involvement and participation. Here in Greece, you might have already heard of the Save Your Hood initiative. It was a movement created during the lockdown period. Thousands of young volunteers coming together to do what? To collect rubbish, to become stewards of their own neighborhoods, to be a part of the change they wish to see in their neighborhoods, rather than expecting someone else to do it for them. I'll give you another example of active participation at a somewhat different level. We believe civil society has to have a voice in policy formulation, in creating laws for the future. Spiros just mentioned earlier on that Greece has taken on an initiative to draft a national climate law. Countries throughout Europe are developing their national climate laws following the European climate law. And we feel very strongly Greece requires such a climate law. So what have we done? We've drafted a law that we hope is based on science, firstly. Secondly, builds on the experience of other European countries where such climate laws already exist. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it's going to be co-created with civil society. You can go into a site, klimatikosnomos.gr, and you can see that draft. And as citizens, you can comment on that draft. You can provide comments and feedback to that draft. So that at the end of the day, hopefully, we will create a proposal that we can hand over to the government. It's not our job to pass laws. It's our job to propose these things. We will make a proposal to the government that's actually been co-created by civil society. And we hope that youth will be a part of it. You are consumers. Your choices in what you wear, what you eat, how you travel, what you do or don't throw away, these all add up and matter. Let me give you just one example. Food waste. On a global level, 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted every year. 1.3 billion tons of food, can you imagine that? And at the same time, 3 million children die every year of malnutrition. But wasted food isn't just a social or a humanitarian concern, it's also an environmental one. When we waste food, we also waste all the energy and the water it takes to grow, harvest, transport, and package it. And if food goes to landfills and rots, it actually produces methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas that's much stronger, more potent than carbon dioxide. In fact, about 6 to 8% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced if we stop wasting food. Now, how relevant is this for us here in this country? Well, according to a recent UN report, Greece presently ranks 3rd in the world in food waste, with each citizen throwing away roughly 140 kilos of food every year. The type of food we choose to eat is also very important. And for those who are interested in learning more about the benefits, the characteristics of a Mediterranean diet, we have actually established a special youth group in WWF Greece. You can contact us if you want to be a part of this, learn more, and get actively involved in these activities. So, in closing, I would just repeat my very strong conviction and belief that the role of you all, young citizens, in building back a better Europe is critical. European institutions and national governments must empower you and give you a voice, but don't expect this to be handed to you on a silver platter. I would encourage you to step up, to challenge the status quo and business as usual approaches, to believe in your abilities, and to be real agents of change. After all, this is your future. Thank you.
Thank you very much about this enlightening speech, I can say, about the human effect on the environment. And I would like to now welcome Mr. Zaimis to make his speech upon how the EU promotes values and standards on the protection of the environment through its trade policy.
Thank you, Stathi, and good morning to everybody. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for this very nice initiative. I have to say I have 2 children which are at IB age, and I know the enormous pressures you have on studying and getting into university. So congratulations for adding on your burdens by organizing this conference. I can fully sympathize with your work. Now, the second point is I also want to thank you because you put me at this panel on the environment, the EU. There is another panel also that deals with trade issues, geopolitical at the very end. But I work in this, I would say, relatively new area, which is about combining trade and sustainable development. And well, the good news is I'm not going to flood you with statistics. When people talk about trade, normally, they throw at you numbers. So I promise not to do that. I will try to talk a bit about the context so we can understand what trade policy is about and how we can help with the problems that have been identified both by Spiros and Dimitris, by the previous speakers. So trade policy in the EU can be a powerful tool. As you know, it's an exclusive competence of the EU, which means that the EU speaks with one voice. When we talk about trade with third countries, we speak with one voice, and it is the EU that can enter into trade agreements with partners. So trade usually was about economic issues. It's about import and export, and many people do not realize, because we live in a single market, that when goods cross borders, actually they have to pay what we call customs duties or customs tariffs. Now, within the EU, we don't experience that, but if you try to import things from, let's say, Asia or the US, then you have to pay a certain amount of tariffs. To give an example, for cars, for example, if you import an American car, you have to pay 10%. So you don't see that as a consumer because it's built in the price, but actually it is there and it is a competitive disadvantage to US exporters. So what is trade policy about? It's about entering agreements, trying to open up markets for European goods to make sure that Greek exports, for example, can be competitive in third markets. And 80% of economic development happens outside the borders of Europe. So it is necessary to be there, to have an active trade policy and try to create wealth. So this is the economic part. But trade and sustainable development covers all 3 pillars of sustainable development. I think Spiros explained very well what are the challenges there. And the 3 pillars are the economic, the social, and the environment. And we deal with all 3, but I will limit my remarks now to the environmental, which is of interest to this panel. So how do we contribute as trade policy? And the first question we need to ask ourselves, it is, we want to promote these values, these European standards, and why do we do that? The question was not, it's not very recent, it has arisen 10 to 15 years ago when drafting the new free trade agreements, and it was raised as an issue of context. Do we want to raise environmental standards and values to be defensive, or do we want to do something more and promote? And the importance of this question for businesses is crucial, because we impose a lot of environmental conditions on businesses in Europe. We have high environmental standards, or we believe we do, and we impose a number of conditions to our businesses in order to produce goods. So the question they ask us is, wait, you put all these on us. What about third countries? Then you are going to enter into trade agreements. They're going to export products to us which are dirty. So you need to make something to make sure that environmental dumping does not happen through trade. So look at it as a defensive. But we thought, this is a good first step. Of course, we need to make sure that we don't undermine our own businesses through our own environmental policy. But however, we can do much better than that. And the challenges are, of course, are global. And as Spiros just showed, climate change is a global challenge. It cannot be resolved by one country, by one partner. So we want to do more. So we have to design a trade and sustainable development chapter that does much more, that promotes standards, promotes these values with partners. So then the second question that will arise, of course, is which values? I mean, do you want countries to adopt European standards, the European acquis? We just want to export, and is this acceptable to them? Because very often they will tell you, but we have our own values, we have our own standards, so it's fine that you have your own, we have our own, so you cannot impose things on us. So what we're trying to do is then we go to the international values and standards. And as Spiros showed previously, a number of international conventions, that support the environment on biodiversity, and of course the Kyoto, and now the most important of all, the Paris. So what we're trying to do is say, look, now we have these international conventions, these are recognized international standards, and this is the minimum we should be doing in order to help the environment. So let's both agree in an agreement that we will effectively implement, we give a legal commitment to each other, we create a commitment to each other that will be implementing these international conventions. And that's an important point, this legal commitment. And I will give you one example, which is quite topical. There is an agreement with Mercosur. We have just negotiated, and part of Mercosur is, of course, Brazil, and Brazil has a lot of issues with, as you know, Amazon and the rainforest. So at some point, the president of Brazil even threatened to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because he was not apparently a believer of climate change. So through this agreement, which is not yet ratified, but hopefully it will be, Brazil made a legal commitment to us, to the EU, that they will stay in the Paris Agreement and that they will try to effectively implement it. So that's a very important way of, let's say, promoting, our values, in third countries, to creating this legal commitment. Now, of course, the question is, what about the scope? And the question is, do we ask these trade partners, to limit these standards only to the products that they'll export to the EU, for the range of products that they will be exporting? And of course, the answer is no. And we have a very broad scope. When we ask these partners to implement these agreements, we ask them to implement them, throughout their territories. We don't believe that a country can have two sets of rules, one set of rules for products that go to the EU, and then another set of rules for everything else. And this applies, as I said, not only to environment, but also to labor rights. So we do ask them to commit that they will apply these agreements, these conditions and international conventions independently of any trade. So we don't ask them to do a trade effect. So if there's a problem in the future with the Amazon, but it's not directly linked to trade with the EU, we'll still have a reason to talk to Brazil about it and see whether we can help and how we can address this issue. So we see that as a very important platform for engagement. Lastly, the other important element we want to include is, of course, your involvement, your as stakeholders, as consumers. So what do? We create through these trade agreements what we call an advisory group. We have an advisory group that will advise us what issues to discuss on environment with these third countries. And these advisory groups try to represent all three pillars of sustainable development, so economic, and social, and environmental. So we have NGOs, we may have Dimitris, for example, in the future, or his organization, or his European headquarters. We may have trade unions, and of course, we want business associations also to be there. So we create these groups, and we ask our partner also to create these groups. Now, that's an important, and a lot of you may not realize that while we have a vibrant, framework of discussing these issues in Europe, this is not necessarily the case in outside the borders of the EU. And if you, make an exception for some really developed countries like Switzerland, Norway, Canada, the US, in many other countries, there is no this vibrant policy space for discussing environment between NGOs and their government. So through these agreements, we try, in a way, we force these governments to create this dialogue, this platform of talking about these issues to their own civil society. And of course, the aim is to have both civil societies in Europe and in third countries to talk to each other. And it's very strange, honestly, my personal experience as a negotiator is when we go to these countries, and of course, I'm a trade official, I'm not an expert on the environment or on labor per se. For that, we use colleagues from the relevant departments. So we go and we talk to our colleagues in the trade ministries in these countries. And then we sit around the table, and they have to bring in their colleagues from the environmental ministry, from the labor ministry. And after one of these meetings, the guy came and he thanked me. He says, thank you, Nico. I said, thank you for what? Well, he says, thank you for giving the opportunity to meet my own colleagues who work on the environment or on labor. I'd never met them because we never had this opportunity to discuss these issues. I'm a trader, I export, textiles, I have nothing to do with these aspects. So, this, gave me some hope that, putting all the elements together, it's perhaps the way to go in the future, and not looking at them, in isolation. So without wanting to talk, to prolong too much, there's many other aspects that we can discuss. And with regards to the environment, I want to highlight two developments for the future that will be coming that we should be aware of. The first is that, of course, notwithstanding agreements and the fact that we ask trade partners to do certain things, there is still, in terms of climate change, the fear of green leakage. Still, it will never be enough, because we intend, as we have just heard from other speakers, in terms of the Green Deal, to do a lot more and put a lot more obligations on companies. So we have to invent a tool that will allow us then at the border to take certain measures when we think that a country outside the EU do not do the same effort. So they may be in the future what we call a carbon border adjustment measure. So essentially, a new tariff, a new tax that will have to be paid by countries who want to export to us and who are not making these efforts on the environment. So if they do, there will be some sort of recognition. But we think this mechanism will send a powerful message to other countries that they do have a responsibility. And the last thing is about business. I talked a lot about government to government, but what about businesses? So other colleagues in the European Commission are working now on what they call a due diligence legislation. So due diligence, what we mean essentially is that businesses, exporters, importers, companies in Europe will have an obligation to look into the supply chain and ask certain questions and say, the product I buy or the component I buy, has it been produced in a way that is respectful to the environment? Has my supplier, respected, the river or the lake and avoided wasting chemicals into that river? Has he avoided using child labor? Because we're talking also about labor issues in these discussions. And so far, businesses had, a let's say, made incentive to do that. Famous businesses would like to say that we're green, and you can see go to supermarket on their products, you see all these yellow and green and red, labels about, how good they are in terms of the environment. but it has been voluntary so far. So the idea now is to make this mandatory. So to ask them, to ask these questions to the suppliers, and ask the suppliers to ask their suppliers. So go down, the whole supply chain to the producer of, let's say, textiles, to the cotton. Was this cotton produced, let's say, in a country in Asia in a way that respects the environment in terms of water usage, water waste, etc., etc. So these are the aspects, and I only talked about the bilateral agreements. There's a whole new world there when we talk about unilateral preferences, where we give preferences to our market, but then we request developing countries to do that. And of course, you have to realize that the difference between developed and developing countries is still huge. It is still real. I think Spiros showed us very well the figures in some other areas in the world about hunger, about poverty. So poverty remains the underlying, let's say, root of many of the problems in the environment and on social issues. And we hope that through trade, we can create some of this wealth that will help generate the funds to address these issues. So the rest for the discussion. Thank you.
You very much about this very interesting speech upon how the environmental policies are now being included in the EU's trade agreements. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Ourios to talk about the EU Green Deal, so what it is and its implementations for the citizens.
Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the amazing organizers of this event. I'm delighted to be here with this fantastic panel. And I'm going to try to give an overview of the European Green Deal. So we know that humanity faces probably the greatest challenge of its history, that is climate change, driven by human action, as has been outlined by our colleagues before. In order to tackle this, the European Commission has launched the European Green Deal with the main objective of making Europe the first ever climate neutral continent by 2050. But what does it mean to be climate neutral? Well, it means that by 2050, the European economy, the EU economy, will at least offset more CO2 than it produces. This task is immense. It's going to be very challenging because also this means that we will have to change many aspects of the way we consume and we produce things, from the way we move across our cities and within our countries, the way we produce electricity, the way we consume goods, such as the clothes we buy, the food we buy, everything. In fact, there are a few aspects of modern life that will not have to be changed in order to reach carbon neutrality. Because 2050 still looks like a faraway date, but it's in less than 30 years. So we have to move quickly. And even if we manage to achieve these rather ambitious targets, it will most likely not even be enough to meet the 1.5 increase of temperature set at the Paris Agreement. And this 1.5 increase already has drastic and irreversible changes to many ecosystems around the world. But it is still remarkable that the European Union has taken global leadership on climate matters. And as I said, the European Green Deal aims to tackle many aspects of our economies. I'm going to just mention a couple of them and try to give a couple of examples of how they are going to impact us directly. So one of them, for example, is one of the policy areas is clean energy. The production of energy in the EU accounts for 75% of the EU environmental footprint. So the objective of the Green Deal is to have the sector decarbonized by 2052. And this, they want to do it with a combination of renewable energy sources and also new technologies that are still in development, such as green hydrogen. So we'll see. And I'm sure also Greece has a lot of potential for renewable energy production. So that's a good thing. Another area is the sustainable industry. So I'm not sure if you know, but only 12% of the materials, so only 12% of the materials used by our industries, they come from recycled resources. And we know as well that 90% of the biodiversity loss and water stress comes from the way we extract resources for production. So just imagine for a moment that instead of throwing this shirt, for example, that you don't like anymore, I mean, instead of throwing it into the bin, so then it ends up in a landfill or burnt, imagine you give it back to the store where you bought it. They give you back a bit of money in order to also incentivize that you go and give it back. And then they use that shirt to make other clothes for the future. That's the circularity of the economy. That is going to be very, very important in order to achieve climate neutrality. Another one is biodiversity protection. We are always talking about the climate crisis, and we are very focused on CO2 emissions and how to reduce that, which of course is very important. But we are also having we are living a massive biodiversity crisis. Some people even consider it as another mass extinction. But okay, just to give a little picture of it, in the past 40 years, 60% of the global population of wild animals has disappeared in just 40 years. Well, the Green Deal, to reverse the situation in Europe, the EU aims to protect 30% of our waters and land, and as well to restore degraded ecosystems through, for example, reforestation, so planting trees. Another key aspect is building and renovation. Buildings in the EU, also our houses, use 40% of the energy consumed in Europe, right? If we renew our buildings, we can tackle a lot of issues at the same time. We can increase energy efficiency, we can reduce energy poverty, and we can also reduce CO2 emissions. So imagine, I mean, I have been in Athens, it's a lovely city, but in summer it gets very hot. So imagine one of hot days in Athens in summer. If you turn off your aircon, if you have one, in probably about 30 minutes or an hour, I would say just 30 minutes, your house is probably already boiling and you are very warm. But if our houses would be better insulated, you could maintain the temperature for longer inside. You could reduce the use of electricity, and also you would save money. So this will be also it's also a very important aspect of the EU Green Deal. Another one is sustainable mobility. So how we move ourselves in the cities, across Europe, internationally, everywhere. Transport accounts for 25%, so a quarter of the EU greenhouse emissions. And this mainly comes from cars, from petrol and diesel cars. The European Green Deal wants to reduce emissions from the sector by 90%. To do so, we need to imagine a future with electric cars, where instead of going to a gas station, you go to a charging station. And the electricity that we are using for those batteries, for our cars, ideally, well, it must come from renewable energy sources. Another key area of the Green Deal is eliminating pollution. So, every second that passes, our economy, our societies, we are putting toxic substances both in the environment and also in our bodies. Because when you are polluting the soil where you then grow your lettuce, and then we eat the lettuce, then we are eating the toxic substances. So the European Commission wants to make a toxic-free environment by 2050. For example, if we reduce or eliminate the worst contaminants or polluters of the cars in the cities, we are not only going to be saving the environment, but people will most likely have less health problems. So we are actually saving lives in a way, right? If society achieves to do that. Anyways, I wanted to give just a couple of the main areas. So all these areas mean that the EU and its member states, including Greece, of course, will have to adapt many of the existing laws and also create new ones. And it also means money, a lot of money. Up to 1 trillion euros is estimated to be needed for the new infrastructures, modernizing value chains, and new business model in order to achieve the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. It's a lot of money, 1 trillion euros. In addition, this green transition must be done taking into account social inequalities, because these economic changes, they always have trade-offs and some winners and losers many times. So This means that money has to be invested in areas that are now economically very dependent on more polluting sources. For example, imagine a region in Poland, for instance, where the whole region depends on the extraction of coal and then the processing of coal for energy production. With the EU Green Deal and with the trends in the energy markets, coal most likely will disappear in the short, medium term, right? So suddenly you have a full region that has lost their source of income, their living income. So these areas have to be invested, they have to be transformed, their jobs into other kind of jobs, into green jobs ideally as well. So that will be important, a just transition that leaves no one behind. And you might think, well, is it all worth it? All the money, all the changes, well, I mean, essentially the cost of no action, even if there are a wide range of estimations, it is much higher, and not only in terms of money, but also in terms of human lives here in Europe and across the world. Yeah, so overall, the European Green Deal, I think, is very important. It's a key milestone in the fight against climate change, and it will change our lives. However, it is important for all of us, and especially the youth, so us and you, to push politicians, as has been said already in this panel before, to push politicians for real change, because, you know, it's not only their planet, it is also our planet, but also the one for the future generations, your sons, whenever that happens. So we need to also empower ourselves as citizens and find out how we can help to protect the planet and to contribute to all these policy abstract areas that I have explained before. Just a quick example, there is no use in having a law that creates, that says that there must be one recycling center in every neighborhood if no one then takes the trash there, or if we don't recycle properly at home. I know it's a classic example, but it is, I think, illustrative. Anyways, I hope I managed to give a snapshot of what the Green Deal is. And I will summarize it in the following way. The deal will make Europe the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. This will change our economy, and this will also change our lives. And hopefully it will allow us to live in harmony with our planet. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting speech. And I would first like to ask you a question. So would you say that 2050 is a realistic goal for the implementation of the Green Deal? And if not, what are the main problems which arise?
Well, 2050, it is indeed it's a pressing date. It is just less than 30 years, but I think it's also a matter of willingness. And I think Europe will be able to achieve it. We will be able to achieve it, but at the end of the day, we need to also think that Europe is quite small compared to other. I mean, it's the second biggest economy in the world, but it's the biggest market. But we need to ask ourselves our role in the world. And even if we achieve the carbon neutrality, we have to see how this carbon neutrality is measured, because we need to take into account that we import most of our goods as well from abroad. So as Mr. Zainis mentioned before, these value chains as well are very, very important, and international agreements and partnerships. So yeah, I think it is manageable, but it needs surely decisive action and ambition and being bold. There is no room for middle way, really.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would now like to ask a question to the whole panel. So in your opinion, will a potentially climate neutral union have some advantages compared to superpowers such as China, which are very behind in environmental issues in comparison to us, Europe? Or will it mean that we are still dependent to countries such as China again for the imports of raw materials? Would somebody like to answer?
Well, I just, sorry, go ahead. No, I just wanted to point it out quickly because I have been working on this recently. Of course, trade is going to be still important, and also the transition and the Green Deal is going to require a lot of raw materials that sometimes they cannot be found in Europe. For example, for the batteries, we are going to need a lot of rare earths are called, so very rare elements that right now 95% of them come from China. So these things are we are going to still be dependent on other countries for this transition as well. So it is very important to push for sustainability as well on that.
Would someone like to add anything?
I just wanted to add, thank you. It's a very good question to say that, of course, it's not an issue only for the EU. This climate change fight cannot be won even if we take the best, measures in the world. We have to convince our partners, to work with us, and we need to foster, trade in green technologies, for example. Help countries which don't have yet, technology on renewables, on wind power, solar power. Of course, this is more easily said than done, and I'll give you a concrete example because it depends if other countries are developed or developing or even least developed countries. So we're working right now on trying to green the supply chain on cacao, exported from mainly 2 West African countries. The cacao that we use to make chocolate. So it's a product everybody knows, everybody likes. But very few people know that we import most of our cacao or cocoa in English from Ivory Coast and Ghana, and that's a big part of the GDP. But a lot of this production is unfortunately tainted with both child labor and deforestation. So a lot of these cocoa plantations are in areas where there are national parks, or rainforests. So how do you actually, help to clean this supply chain, because everybody would like, of course, to, when they buy chocolate, to make sure that this is done in an area which is not from deforestation and is not made with children. Now, there are enormous difficulties. The first being, as I said, poverty being a big driver, of deforestation in a lot of these countries where farmers simply don't have other choices. And, if there is a good price for cocoa, they will go into cocoa. And if they have to go into a national park, to earn a living, they will do that. So, and the same with their children. No family wants their children to work. They don't do it for fun. They do it because they're very poor and they need, the means to survive. So how do you help clean the chain and at the same time address, deforestation concerns? Because these are interlinked. If you don't help, if you don't address the poverty issue, you will not address deforestation, because deforestation will continue. So there are no magic solutions, and of course, we'll try to engage into a sort of, a framework with these countries. Make sure that they understand the commitment, not to deforestate, but at the same time they will need help, and this help will need to be both financial in terms of projects, but also capacity building. And lastly, we as consumers, we also have to face our responsibilities. And I saw a question about transparency. When we make choices, we go to the supermarket, we should be trying to prefer, products that have made the effort, to meet this, as I said before, due diligence, and when we pick chocolate, to make sure that the chocolate is from companies that have, been working on deforestation in these countries and on child labor. So it's not going to work in a couple of years. It's not going to work perhaps in a decade, and it's most likely a generational issue. But we have indeed to start now, because there's very little time left.
Stathis, can I add two dimensions to this? I think what both Jesus and Nikos said is very important, because you have to combine everything in this value chain process. But then there's 2 more things that I believe the European Union can be a very important leader in that sense. One is a sector in which it is lagging behind in other areas, which is how you turn research and development into proper production systems, business, and so on. And it seems like Europe has now understood that it needs to connect the output of R&D to what actually becomes what is used in technologies and so on in real life. And I think that the new part of R&D in the green transition in the EU Green Deal is one that will hopefully give Europe a leading edge on this. So the second is that Europe traditionally is I would think, the region in the world that seems to be very strong in producing policies. That sometimes is a very bad thing because producing too much of it, but it can be also a very important thing, because if you take, for example, Europe is now working to become probably the first region in the world where there will be set rules and ways of measuring how the impact investment and sustainable investment is going on through the taxonomy, through ESG finance, environmental, social, and governance finance, and so on. Another thing is what was mentioned by other speakers before, the farm to fork policy. Another one is the blue economy policy, in which it is a global leader. So these things are actually things that can provide Europe with a competitive advantage, because it's not only the decarbonization, it's the decarbonization along with such policies that can give it a competitive advantage. And as I try to explain in my presentation, also make it a player that can build bridges to work with other regions in the world. And this is where we should be looking for the actual benefits that can come from the Green Deal. If it works well, these are the things that will happen. If it doesn't, we'll have to correct it, but I don't think we have the time to correct it.
Yeah, if I could just add a short story. A few years back, I remember in 2009, I believe, it was the time of the climate COP 15 in Copenhagen. And it was really one of these critical meetings where everyone had sort of positioned it as a now or never event, the time where the countries need to come together and really take tough decisions on addressing the climate crisis. And I was actually there. I had the honor of being one of the NGOs present at that meeting. I think Spiros was also there. It was a very, very frustrating time, because we saw over a course of days, thousands of people had come together to this climate conference, and each country was looking at each other to make the move. So the European Union was saying, well, let's see what China is going to say, and then the United States, is Obama going to step up and do something really big? Or India, what's India going to do and all this? And by the end of the week, we had no serious result. I think actually the failure of COP15 led to the success of the Paris Agreement, but we lost a lot of time. And I would say that now we are in a situation where the time has run out, and we drastically need leadership on this issue. And I think that the European Union up until now is looking to provide that leadership. There's more that needs to be done. We're not entirely happy with everything that's in the Green Deal and the ambition level. It needs to be clear to all of us that we need to follow the science. This cannot be a product of compromise another time. The science is absolutely clear, whether we're talking about the biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis, on what needs to happen, and we need to follow that. But I would say now is the time for leadership. And if that leadership does come forward, I think there will be very important advantages for markets in these regions, but I think it's also a critical moral obligation that we shouldn't ignore.
Thank you very much for all your answers. So I would like another question to you, Mr. Karavellas. Would you say there's something missing from the Green Deal? Because you said we're not entirely happy with the Green Deal.
Yes, I think there's a big discussion right now, of course, in Europe around, Jesus also mentioned the money, which is a big thing. The very big issue is, as I said, will we follow the science? Will we follow the emission targets that are required? Whether it's 50 or 55%, we think we need to go to 65%, for example. But I think, we recently came out with an announcement basically saying the Green Deal needs to really pass 5 tests, I would say. The first one is that we need to have mutually reinforcing targets on decarbonization and on nature restoration, based on, as I said, what science dictates. The second one is that we actually need to do more about the transition to sustainable food systems. It's a really critical part of that. and address the EU's global footprint. The third one is all about delivery, actually. Spiros mentioned policies and laws. We really need to have zero tolerance for non-compliance or weak implementation of environmental laws. And Greece has a ways to go in that, unfortunately. The fourth one is about the money. Jesus mentioned 1 trillion euros that's needed in this. Well, we need to be shifting the money in the right direction, and the Recovery and Resilience Fund is going to be an important part of that. But we also need to ensure that money is not going in the wrong direction, and that's all about really, stopping financial support, for example, for fossil fuel use. We cannot continue to have subsidies in fossil fuel use and at the same time say, let's invest in renewables and energy efficiency. That's schizophrenic. And I think the fifth one, which is also very important and other panelists have mentioned, is we need to make sure that this is just. We need to guarantee that this is a just transition and that no one is going to be left behind in the process. So there are a number of challenges in making this work.
Thank you very much for your answer. And I would now like to move on to some questions from the Q&A, which are very interesting. So a person has asked, individuals can solve the climate crisis. How can we collectively reach a change in terms of climate crisis, first locally, then national-wide, and so on? How to put the right pressure, let's say, on the right institutions, people, etc. Would anybody want to have an answer to this?
Well, maybe I'll start on that. I would tend to disagree on the initial statement that we cannot do something about the climate crisis. I think we can. And I reflected on that, I think, in my intervention, in the way we travel and the choices that we make. But I do at the same time think that now is the critical time for policies to change and for those bold decisions that haven't taken place in Copenhagen or in other places to actually happen now. And that's all about us. That's all about civil society standing up and demanding those. We need to reach a stage where political inaction or inertia around these issues carries a political cost. And the only one that can do that out there is us, as civil society, as individuals, making that message clear. I think Nikos and Spiro were talking about the change also in businesses. Well, businesses are realizing that if they don't get their act together, if they don't seriously green their business, that comes with a very clear reputational risk. And that's because consumers are asking different things. So let's not underestimate, I think, the power that we have in actually making these changes. Yes, we need to read up on the topic. Yes, we need to be sharp about when the decisions are taking place and really to make these messages clear. But I think for the youth, especially, for example, the power of social media as a tool is massive, and don't underestimate what that can actually do. I would say we actually, a lot does depend on us, and we can't just wait around for those policies to change or for the private sector to change. We need to be conveying that message in every possible way, that change is something that we need and we want.
Can I add something? I mean, add something and possibly go a little bit to the continuing questions as well, because I think what Dimitri says is very correct. If you just take yourself out of the equation and expect the leadership to do all the work, nothing will happen. What we have seen time and again is that in policy making, there's two things that happen. In some cases, you have the leadership that actually pulls everything, and this is what Dimitri explained about the case of the European Union vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But very often, we have seen that policy making follows the trends that are set by people. That can be a very important thing. And just to come to the last question that we had in the Q&A, somebody was asking what we are doing. I'll just give you an example. What I am doing with my family, with my wife at home, is that we have practically eliminated waste. So what we do is we have a small composting, so we don't have any organic waste. We try to buy things, and we do it on purpose, to buy things that have less packaging, because that's the main bulk of waste that we have. And if we all push in that direction, then companies will have to reduce packaging as a whole, because, you know, over packaging things is a very, very wrong thing to do. So, you know, in this way, you can actually lead to policy changes, because as a consumer and as a voter, like Dimitri said before, you have a lot of power, more than you actually think, because you see yourself as a unit.
I would also like to add one thing. At the end of the day, I think it's a collective effort, and it's because the challenge is so big, but it requires collective action. And for this, I think it's also very important that the regulations or the changes of the policies do not only focus on, you know, setting targets or let's reduce setting targets on less packaging or more, you know, these kind of policies, but also in the underlying policies, for example, related to consumer empowerment, for example, labeling, information, because it's very hard to say if the leadership does not set the policies to inform consumers, then also it's also quite hard for consumers to make the right choices that we might want to do, but then we don't do because, you know, we don't have the information requiring. So it's also very important, I think, for the European Deal to implement very important policies on labeling and consumer information, transparency, and that's the basic element for individuals to also start having more decisive action to tackle climate change.
Thank you very much to all. Very interesting answers upon what each of us can do to battle climate change. So before we close this panel, I would like to ask a final question from the Q&A section, which I found significant. So there has been asked, is there also a new role for research, for science and technology and innovation in addressing the Sustainable Development Goals? Mr. Kouvelis, would you like
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, and this is for me one case where Europe can really excel, can be a global leader, because there is very much good research going on in Europe, in both universities and research centers and everything. The critical point is to connect it to the real life, to make it part of the technologies and developments that will be the driver of the European economy as a whole. But I think that in every aspect of sustainable development, not only the environmental ones, also for social things. Just think the potential of applications and interconnectivity that can have for research and development. Just examples that reduce people's mobility and burning fossil fuels to go around, like the Zoom that we're using right now, for example. It's not a European thing, but still, that reduces all the fuels that the five of us would have burned to just get together in a meeting and to speak to people. So, you know, there are lots of things that can happen out of development and of good research, and I think that can be a very important part of work for Europe.
Would anyone like to add something? Okay, perfect. So we will now come to close this panel, as we're also a bit over time. So thank you very much for your participation. I think it was an enlightening discussion generally about the environment globally and from the European perspective. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, Staffy. Bye-bye.
Bye.